In the past year that I've been power scaling on this account, I've made innumerable claims, and while I still stand by most of them, there are some that I no longer agree with and thus must correct. In the same way I corrected my stance on Yamamoto's Bankai, I present to you the size of Las Noches and the Seireitei reanalyzed. Let's start from the beginning. Within the bleach power scaling community, the size of Las Noches and the Seireitei has been and still is a very contentious topic that ultimately has two factions. On one hand, you have the proponents of the statement/narrative, and on the other hand, you have those advocating for the depiction/visuals. Via this statement made by Yoruichi and this one made by Nell, the first group argued that the Seireitei and Las Noches have a respective parameter of roughly 1.5 to 4.6 thousand kilometers and 350 to 700 kilometers. The latter group don't agree with this and argue that the countless visual depictions of both Las Noches and the Seireitei aren't consistent with these values. Doing some simple pixel scaling, which is just a mathematical estimation on size based on relative scale, these structures are shown to be much smaller. The Seireitei can hardly reach a diameter of 6 kilometers with generous estimates, with Las Noches not faring any better, reaching a maximum length of around 15 kilometers. The proponents of the statements then argue that the narrative should take precedent over the visuals while disregarding them as just an artistic error. In addition, the visuals are also inconsistent with themselves, as with every shot you look at, the value changes. The proponents of the visuals then respond by saying, while yes, the visuals are inconsistent with themselves, they stay within a specific margin. They don't vary by dozens or hundreds of kilometers, if not just by a few kilometers, 10 at most in one instance. These minor inconsistencies can be simply chalked up to artistic error, as we cannot expect illustrators to be pixel perfect within every illustration. However, it doesn't make sense for the illustrator to consistently show that these structures lie within a specific range whose variation can be chalked up to minor artistic errors, while also, in every single instance, being hundreds if not thousands of kilometers off the actual size of the structures. Like, how can the illustrator possibly mess up the scale that consistently and that badly? The argument then goes on and on from here, with it seeming as if common ground is unattainable. To simplify each stance, the proponents of the statements argue for narrative superiority and insist that statements should be taken above all things, especially when you can establish that the characters making those claims are credible. The proponents of the visuals argue for consistency, suggesting that the statements cannot be true due to innumerable inconsistencies, while also establishing that these structures are consistently within a specific range. In the past, I was a proponent of the visuals. Within 2 segments of the second video posted to this channel, I pointed out the innumerable visuals we are given which contradict the size of these structures and consistently show that they are within a specific range. Many months later, I was thinking about what I said in that video, and I decided to make an Instagram exclusive post where I doubled down and reinforced my stance. Excluding merely pointing out how the visuals are consistently within a specific range and contradict the statements we are given, I argued the following in my Instagram post. 1. Since both stances, the statements and the visuals, are contradictory to each other, we have to accept that a true and consistent size cannot be established as it is non-existent. Therefore, if we hope to use the size of these structures for scaling, we must use the smallest size that can reasonably be established and just say that the feat scales unquantifiably above this. 2. Margins of error and acceptability are on an inversely proportional scale. Accurate proportions, size, and scales are things all illustrators take heavily into consideration if the goal of their illustration is an approximation of realism. Given Bleach basically uses our world as a basis to be built on, it fits into this classification. Thus, the illustrator would approximate realism, as is the case with most fictional stories, especially those with visuals. So while we cannot expect them to represent everything down to the millimeter with perfect accuracy, we can expect them to at least give us reasonable scales of things. In other words, we have margins which cover the acceptability of errors. As the margin increases, the acceptability decreases. By acceptability, I refer to how it can be disregarded. If a character is of average height and it is off by a few centimeters in some shots, it is acceptable and this minor visual variation can be excused. But if it's off by like hundreds of centimeters, then it cannot be excused and inconsistencies ensue. Conditions apply, of course. Based on this, the variation we see in the size of the structures is within an acceptable margin of error. Thus, it can be excused as artistic errors. However, the massive disparity between the supposed size and the size we are shown cannot be said to be within an acceptable margin of error. 3. Intention and depiction are two distinct things with different levels of importance. While the author may have intended the structure to be a specific size, what they actually consistently depict within an acceptable margin of error is something else entirely. What is discussed is not necessarily intention, if not depiction. Thus, the constant and complete quote-unquote misrepresentation of size cannot simply be disregarded because it was not what the author intended. Fourthly, the narrative is not infallible. In the same way an author can make a visual error, they can make a narrative error. Lastly, many bleach scalers are statement proponents and favor it because it upscales the verse. This is less of a pro-visuals argument and more so me explaining why I believe that many bleach scalers favor the other side. I argued that they favor it because it upscales the verse and not because of the reasoning itself. I suggest that if it were the other way around, if these buildings were depicted as being hundreds of kilometers in size but only stated to be a few kilometers in size, the amount of proponents for each side would drastically shift, with many bleach scalers arguing for the visuals as opposed to against them. But over a year has passed since I discussed this topic, and after giving it some more thought and thorough research, I've changed my mind. I am now a proponent of these statements. You see, the main reason I was a proponent of the visuals was because of two things. The first was that many of those who argued for the statements just chose to disregard the visuals and say that the narrative is superior because it was what the author meant without any other real justification. This rationale and stance was unsatisfactory to me as it simply disregarded the visuals as opposed to rationally justifying their coexistence with the statements. I am also a person who is quite strict with what I'm willing to accept and opt for falsification as a means of arriving at the truth. So when both sides have significant problems, I just decided to go with the lowest end and say that it is unquantifiably above that, as upholding consistency was the main goal. Since that could not be achieved, I saw no side as being infallible. The second reason is because of poor research. As I'll show later on in this video, there are mountains of evidence suggesting that the statements are true, and using the visuals as a means to falsify it is a flawed stance. However, my arguments were formed solely based on what I saw people on Instagram saying. Sure, as I now go back and look, they did present some of this evidence, however, they never presented all of it in a convincing manner. If not, they did so despairingly, with their main point being that the narrative was superior while using Nell's statement as their main and what felt like only piece of evidence. They were valid in their claim, but the justification was unsatisfactory to me. I then based my entire argument off of that without trying to find every piece of evidence available. Another reason I didn't even try to look was because I held the belief that consistency must be achieved. Since this couldn't be achieved, I decided to compromise and just use the lowest end for scaling. Since I didn't find anyone who could explain why it wasn't necessary for consistency to absolutely be upheld and wouldn't just disregard the visuals as errors, I stood on my beliefs and saw them as justified. Granted, it wasn't like I launched some kind of crusade to see who could do such a thing. If not, it was just based on the things I saw a lot of people saying alongside the discussions I had with various individuals. Nevertheless, the simple truth is that I was not justified and the visuals are irrelevant. Here's why. Regardless of what the illustrator draws and how far removed from the statements and margin of error it is, the author still considers these structures as being a particular size. Thus, from the author's perspective, the destruction of these structures are equivalent to a particular size in real life. And that's what we should use, the author's view, not how they choose to depict it. As illogical as many, including myself, may find it, Kubo seems simply incapable of accurately representing the scale of immensely massive structures in a visual manner when it comes to illustrations of them as a whole. This may be due to the author not even being capable of fully conceiving just how massive these structures are, which is understandable to a degree, but that is irrelevant. If Kubo sees the Seireitei as larger than the UK, it is larger than the UK, even if he doesn't really fully understand or conceive of just how large that is. You yourself don't likely understand or fully conceive the scale of certain things. If I said 982 trillion square kilometers, you know that it is an immensely large area. However, due to the fact that you may not have a frame of reference, you have no idea just how large that is. You know that it is large, but you don't know just how large. Using a different example, you know that the sun is immensely large, like astronomically large. However, you cannot accurately visualize the size of the sun. Hell, you cannot even visualize the size of the earth. You can only truly understand or visualize the size of things when they are shown to scale to other things. When things become so massive that it is beyond your personal scope, you can only partially understand its size. Returning to the argument, the fact that the shots don't support the apparent size of the structures can reasonably be chalked up to Kubo not fully grasping just how large that is. Thus, he cannot accurately represent it. So, while he may not fully grasp what something that size would actually look like, he does want it to be that size and does consider it to be that size. He also tries to show that it is that size in more subtle ways, such as with reactions. That's why I'm not a proponent of the narrative and consider the statements to be true. With that being said, it's now time to properly calculate their size, taking the statements as true. In chapter 76, Yoruichi implies that it is a 10-day walk in between each one of the Seireitei's gates. In chapters 72 and 76, it is shown that the Seireitei is circular, having gates on each of the 4 cardinal directions. Thus, if it takes 10 days to go from one gate to the other, it follows that it takes 40 days to walk around the whole thing. There are arguments suggesting Ichigo may have immensely high stamina, such as being able to train for 5 days and 5 nights and running for a whole week. While there are some minor contentions with these, I'll still use 3 different ends, as even with a conservative estimate, the Seireitei's size will still be very great. 40 days is 960 hours. The lowest end will postulate that they rest for 12 hours a day or half a day. The middle end will postulate that they rest for 8 hours a day. The high end will postulate that they are not resting at all and are walking all day and all night. This means that they're walking for 12, 16, and 24 hours a day, respectively. Thus, the total walking time becomes 320, 480, and 960 hours, respectively. A 2020 study claims that the average healthy person under 30 can walk at a pace of about 5 kilometers an hour, with many other studies corroborating this. This gives us a total circumference of the Seireitei of 1,544, 2,317, and 4,634 kilometers, respectively. This means that the Seireitei would have a diameter of 491, 737, and 1,475 kilometers, respectively. In other words, the Seireitei has a diameter approximately ranging between 500 and 1,500 kilometers. Okay, but what about Las Noches? Well, in chapter 248, Nell wonders why Ichigo is bursting through the wall, as she states that the gate is only a 3-day walk away from their current position. Unlike statements surrounding the Seireitei, this is kind of hard to calculate since we don't know their exact position or what gate she's referring to. However, we can make some fair assumptions to get an idea of what this 3-day walking distance marks. In chapter 245 and 247, we see them traveling directly towards Las Noches. It seems that they're right in the middle or closer to the left side of the structure. It also seems that they're facing the back of the building. The reason I say this is because Nell says the gate is a 3-day walk away from their current position. This seemingly suggests that there's only one gate. Ichigo also interpreted this as such, claiming that they just can't walk through the front door. Since we don't see anything of the such on the side Ichigo and company are traveling towards, it leads me to believe that there's a main entrance at the center of the other side of the building. Here's a quick illustration of what I'm thinking. I assume Las Noches has a rectangular parameter because of this shot. I assume that the gate is at the center of the other side because I feel that it's more reasonable than the other possible locations. Like, for one, Las Noches is like a massive palace. Why would you have the entrance to the palace on the short side of the building as opposed to the center of the longer side? It would be more aesthetically pleasing to have it at the center while also following the design of many in real life structures with a rectangular-like parameter. For example, the White House and the Capitol building, to name a few. If this is the case, it would mean that it takes 3 days to walk around half of Las Noches' parameter. This is assuming that Ichigo and company are at the center of the other side of the building, that the gate is at the center of the other side of the building, and that Nell is pointing to the left. Keep in mind that these values are only possible with the laid out assumptions. It could also be that the main entrance isn't on the opposite side of the building. But since Ichigo interprets what Nell says as suggesting that the gate is like a main entrance or front door, I think it is reasonable. I'll be using the same resting assumptions as before. 3 days is 72 hours and the average walking pace is about 5 kilometers an hour. If they are resting 12 hours a day, that means they're walking for 36 hours, giving us a total distance of 173 kilometers. Since this is half of Las Noches' parameter, the final length is 347 kilometers. Doing this for the other two ends yields a final length of 463 and 694 kilometers. Again, keep in mind this is only because of the laid out assumptions. At absolute bare minimum, and if you want to be very extreme, you can say that it takes 3 days to travel around the total parameter of Las Noches. This is highly unlikely, but if it was the case, then it would mean it has a parameter of 180 to 360 kilometers depending on how long you assume they're resting, if at all. Juxtapose this with other calculations which may suggest that Las Noches' parameter is like over 800 kilometers. With that calculation over, I can now move on to the final part of the video, which will show the mountains worth of evidence supporting that these statements are quite consistent and valid, while also completely shutting down those who try to falsify them by using the visuals. While I don't feel it is necessary, I'd still like to mention I made this on 6/28/2015 on Reddit and Heavy Return 77 on Top Strongest Wiki for making me aware of all these things with their postings. It wouldn't have felt right if I just took the scans they used and acted as if I found them on my own. Also, since I didn't find them, nor do I recall where exactly they are located, I will not mention the source for all of them since I'm not entirely sure and I don't want to spend countless hours looking for an exact citation. So while I won't adhere to my usual practice of being precise with my sources, I do not believe it is necessary that I am, since, for the most part, they are self-evidently valid. Anyways, let's begin laying everything out. Within the Bleach manga, we are shown that there are mountain ranges within the Seireitei. Supporting this is that what I assume to be one of the Can't Fare Your Own World novels suggests that within the Seireitei, there are mountainous terrains. Given mountain ranges generally exceed hundreds of kilometers, it is consistent with the statement Yoruichi makes. Early on in the first invasion of the Seireitei, it is said to have at least 601 districts. This may be suggesting 601 districts in total, or just in the west. The meaning of district here is also up for contention. It could just be a division of the Seireitei, or it could refer to an actual term for administrative division. While they have no exact size, having 600 districts is a lot, and if they're saying that there are over 600 districts in just the west, then the total number of districts likely exceeds 1,000. For reference, Afghanistan has almost 400 districts, Japan has about 500, and Vietnam has over 700. In Vietnam, the smallest district has an area slightly above 2 square kilometers, while its largest district has an area of almost 3,000 square kilometers. In Afghanistan, the smallest district has a size of around 200 square kilometers, while its largest is about 10,000 square kilometers. Since the Soul Society, and by extension the Seireitei, seems to be heavily inspired by Japanese culture, just as the Espadas are inspired by Hispanics and the Quincy by Germans, does seem reasonable and quite plausible, supporting that this structure is very massive. In the chapters going over Yuha in the past, one of his subordinates refers to the Soul Society as a country. The idea of a country doesn't have a specific size, but this does support that the Seireitei is as massive as the statement suggests and not just a few or even a dozen kilometers in diameter. But one of the best supporting pieces of evidence comes from the Fade to Black movie, where a Reishi leak is said to span 200 spirit miles. In the movie, we can see that this begins at the outermost edge of the Seireitei and heads towards its center. This is then substantiated by a statement suggesting it is spreading in the east-west direction. This either means it's spreading from east to west or from the west to the east, as there is no in-between. Since it is stated this covers 1/3 of the Seireitei's area, it implies that it has a diameter of 600 spirit miles. Now, I've seen some people suggest that this spirit mile translation is actually in reference to a Japanese unit of measurement called the ri, which is approximately 4 kilometers, but I haven't been able to verify it myself. It could also just be ordinary miles or a completely made up unit of measurement. But via the two prior interpretations, it means that the Seireitei would have a circumference of 3,000 to 7,400 kilometers. The first end is well within my calculations and the second end is vastly above it. Either way, it being within thousands of kilometers is congruent with everything that I've laid out and with what was stated, consolidating the idea that the Seireitei is the size of an actual massive country. While this movie is non-canon, Kubo was heavily involved with it as stated in an interview, which further supports the notion that it is meant to be taken seriously. With that being said, we can now move on to Las Noches. While there are many things suggesting its massive size, the most significant pieces of evidence are the thickness of its walls, the size of other structures, and the various aerial shots. For the walls, their size is immediately noted in chapter 247 to the point it looks as if they're running through a massive tunnel. Even after exiting the tunnel, they are still within Las Noches' wall, just a hollow part of it. They would then diverge onto 5 different paths and go on to fight different individuals in rooms or areas that don't appear that small. So, chapters 248 to 261 all takes place within the walls of Las Noches, with Ichigo not leaving the walls until he is blasted out of them in chapter 271. For the size of structures, we see that relative to other things such as people, they are immense. Examples are the pillar in the final fight between Ichigo and Grimmjow, which, in the anime, their size is really impressive. There's also a statement suggesting that the espadas may individually have their own palace. In the Rukia and Aroniero fight, there's a building believed to be Aroniero's palace, housing a massive thing which is capable of moving around and fighting. In the Mayuri and Zailaporo fight, we see a structure destroyed which is believed to be Zailaporo's palace. In the fight between Ichigo and Grimmjow, we see what appears to be Tyr's palace, who appears immensely small to what is seemingly a minor portion of it. If you recall, when we see Aroniero's palace and in other shots, we are able to see Las Noches' wall. However, in various other aerial shots from what is likely quite high in the air, we don't see anything. It's like if it doesn't exist. While this last one doesn't really mean Las Noches is as large as I postulate, it does work as supporting evidence. Combining it with everything I've laid out previously, I believe this consolidates the already solid notion that Las Noches is over 100 kilometers across. And yeah, that's about it for now. Thank you for watching and have a good one. Bye.